Across Bath, Westbury and Warminster, this is Radio Bath.
And this is Brave Business Conversation. We're still in the studio with Unividual, Cherie-Anne Baxter and Greg Harris. We're still talking about protecting our personal net worth in a relationship. Guys, how do we even have that conversation, right? Everything is so sensitive around finance.
And morbid.
And morbid. Death and finance.
Exactly.
Dinner topic.
Yeah.
On Valentine's Day.
My brother does my finances and he advises us, and I'll never forget that day where he came round and we went from talking about going to Hawaii to how we'd like to be buried.
Yeah.
and I had
Was the going to Hawaii was just like an intro?
Yeah, they weren't linked. Just to be clear,
know.
there isn't a link there between you going to Hawaii and being buried there.
I mean, we've been, and I survived, so... but it's hard, isn't it, to sort of sit down and have these quite emotive conversations.
Well, my mom and dad used to say that when you're dating or courting, right, you have to have the conversation there. Don't proceed to a marriage or whatever, the civil partnership. Don't commit until you had the conversation. Actually, don't talk about anything nice during your dating period. Just talk about morbid things. And if you're still together, you're meant to be.
Winner.
Winner.
We need to change a lot on the website. We're gonna quote your parents if that's okay.
Yeah, that sounds great.
But you have touched on something there though, because there's a huge lack of confidence in the industry as a whole. And again, without segregating people out, if you look at women in particular, there's a stat out there where basically 30% of females between 18 and 24 feel very unconfident about managing their own finances. So there's that element of taboo of, I don't talk about money in front of people, and that's I would say it's quite a British and institutionalised thing, unfortunately, that we just don't talk about money when we really need to. But also then there's the lack of understanding as to where to go to find information. And I think people often associate, I'm talking about my pension or talking about investments, that I have to go to a financial advisor. Yes, that's probably where you're going to get the best quality advice, but actually there's so much out there at the moment on the internet, again, with a careful pinch of salt, which gives you people a really, really good starting point, builds up their confidence. What's an ISA, what's a mortgage, what's a pension, and then they can then make the decision of whether they need to then go and find a financial advisor they want to work with longer term. I think that's probably the best way to start that position.
So getting back to the topic of personal net worth, you are initially independent people, right? Getting into some kind of marriage or partnership. What do you recommend? Do you recommend putting the funds together and having one couple's bank account, or keeping it separate, or do half and half, or how do you do it?
Again, it's without sitting on the fence. It really depends on the couple. So, for instance, I know that my wife and I, and bear in mind of what I do for a job, we keep things very separate. We know, how much each other have got in the banks, but we quite like the idea of my money and her money, and that works for us. But again, some people, but that probably relates to people that are quite similar in their earnings and their profession, because it is quite even, so it doesn't really matter if one of us pays for dinner or one of us gets it next time, or holidays and things like that. But I think often when couples have a bigger difference, are closer to an 80-20 split in earnings, which isn't uncommon, it's then about understanding, well, actually it's probably more sensible to have a joint account, because things filtering through and you might have different bills or different outgoings in individual names, when actually it makes sense to bring everything together and have it go out under one roof.
We've brought everything together, but we've been together 18 years, and you do get to a point where you're like, I can't be bothered to have a separate bank account with separate statements and trying to keep on top of everything. And sometimes it's a laziness thing, and to keep things organised, we've got separate. We've got our own accounts, so if I want to buy a surprise for Laura, she's not going to see it come out of the man account.
Yeah, exactly right. Diamond ring.
That diamond ring, yeah. But at the same time, we have the bulk of our incomings and outgoings coming into one account. And because I run a business as well, I've also got my own accountant looking at things, so it can come quite complex. So like Greg says, it's about the individual person, how they like to organise themselves, but how they feel comfortable doing it. But what we've notably found, that these difficult conversations couples are not always great at talking about together. Sometimes they need an independent person to kind of mediate that conversation in a way, to make sure that both people are heard, both people are listened to. So quite often the role of an advisor is to coach people as well and say, look, we do need to have a difficult conversation about what you're spending, or why this person is spending this amount on this and they shouldn't really be doing that, or, for example, how you should be saving more, or even harder, those conversations about what happens after death.
Yeah, I think it's almost like people in your industry should create, like, you know, like those thinking question journals that we have about well-being and everything. Do one for finance, because we need a list of questions. Okay, if I am going to sit down and with my partner and talk about it, what are the list of questions? And before that, even like, what's the mindset that I need to be in to have that conversation in a productive way? Because sometimes when you're scared, when you're already scared, let's say you're starting to feel like the marriage or the relationship's not going well, and now you're starting to think about it, and it's been 15 years, that whole conversation just comes out the wrong way.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You know, because of your fears being projected into it up front.
Definitely.
Or if, let's say, you are early in the game, everything is still nice, then you might have a conversation, but you're not that serious about it because everything is still rosy.
I think it goes back down to that point there with most things in life. It's always better to be proactive than reactive.
Yeah.
And I'm a firm believer in having those conversations, not quite to the extent that your mum and dad were telling you to have, granted. But no, I do think that there's a sensible conversation. But again, people find it difficult because they don't have the knowledge necessarily, or they don't feel confident in it. Or again, we go back to that taboo of, I don't want people to know how much I earn. And in a lot of other countries, for instance, people actually go completely other end of the spectrum and almost brag about what their earnings are. You don't, you very rarely.
I come from that country. I get it. Every dinner and lunch conversation.
Exactly. And again, I quite like the fact that we're not quite that level. But somewhere in between, about saying, well, actually, yes, I am earning this. So, on the basis that we're earning more, or I'm earning more than you, or you're earning more than me, it makes sense that I take on that responsibility rather than you do. And I think one thing that Cherie-Anne mentioned about sort of the administrative side of things on it, very often we sit down in front of couples who do keep things separately, and they're both paying for the same thing. It could be small things like they both got a Spotify account. Well, actually, you can add each other.
Spotify thanks you for your for your double business.
Yes, or so many subscriptions, and actually.
Yeah. Just to keep it separate, and it's almost a little bit too hygienic, isn't it?
It is a little bit
calculative,
but it works for some people.
But
so for instance, a good example of that is people that are self-employed, whether that's one person in the couple or both people. If you're self-employed and you're not going through that limited company account structure, actually you probably want to keep your accounts separate so that you can then clearly see what incomings and outgoings you've got in one account, so that you can give that off to your accountant to make sure that's correct, rather than, right, okay, I've now got to separate a joint account of what my profit and loss is.
Well, you shouldn't mix business and personal account anyway, but
I think the starting point is discussion together. I think this is the main thing, because traditionally, if we roll back our business was first established 20 years ago, and you had a situation where you had the husband contacting the firm, and you'd be saying, well, we need to involve your wife in these decisions. Whereas things have moved and changed a lot now, but we still get people are not grasping that women are actually the main instigators into seeking financial advice, even if the man in the relationship has made that inquiry. And it's about making sure that as a business, we're brave enough to go, this is about both of you, and getting you both of you involved. Because later on down the line, if one of you passes away, you're both educated on what is in the pot and how it's going to work.
And it doesn't matter if the husband or the wife pays for the consultation. You have to be neutral, don't you? Yeah, absolutely. We'll be back with more conversation, and I want to get into that list of questions. Maybe even think about, like, how do we start this conversation? What's your starting line? Let's talk about...
Like a chat-up line for finances.
Chat-up line for finances. Slightly close to, do you come here often? That's to get a date. But, how to start that financial conversation after this.
Radio Bath.
And we're still with Brave Business Conversation. We've been having lots of good chats. So we're coming up with a new journal together, apparently. No, just kidding.
No,
it's just them.
No, I'm not kidding.
No, so we talked about having that conversation, right? And we talked a little bit about why it's important. How do you start it? Give us some chat-up lines. Hey, how's the weather? Oh, by the way, you want to talk about finance?
Mine are not pre-watershed, unfortunately. So, no, I think that it's again, you are definitely the marketing skill in this team, so I'll default to you shortly. But I think really it's about understanding what people want. So, it's not about saying a massive question like, what do you want in life? It's like, right, okay, what are we trying to achieve over the next 12 months? And I know that's a conversation that my wife and I have quite regularly, more frequently than every 12 months. But, you know, for instance, you know, do you want to buy a new property, or do you want to, you know, get your savings up to a certain level, or, you know, do one of you want to buy a new car? It's anything from, or actually, do you want to go on holiday somewhere? Because without knowing that, then you're both almost or wandering out into the financial abyss. So I think that's quite a nice, easy opener without any pressure.
I like that, because that's a goal-setting conversation together. Like, what do we want to achieve? And of course, every goal will require some kind of budget. Or
and then I think you look at how we're going to get there. So quite often people will double use pots of money. So they'll say, well, that's for retirement, but then they're to get their holidays.
the Cornwall holidays coming out of that too.
Or sometimes people might want a car and get probably, you know, too much finance on that car instead of balance. You know, let's face it, the novelty of car does wear off after a while once you've had it over a year. So how do we balance between having a nice car but still saving for retirement? So the how question, people are not very good at starting with what do we want to achieve, but then once they've done that, it's how are we going to achieve it? And that's where there's a lot of research and a lot of financial knowledge to be able to make sure that is correct and right. And then I think the next step from that is, okay, we've put up and we're doing it. It's then, are we constantly reviewing that and checking that's still the case? Because let's face it, a year goes by like that, and before you know it, your 12-month plan that you put in place is gone, and you're for another year or so instead of working towards those goals. So I think it's a mixture of short-term planning, but then long-term, medium planning as well.
Yeah, a client of mine, he actually has a family ritual. The kids were very small back then, but of course it's him and the wife. But as they grow older, it becomes a family thing to sit down every 3 months and do a vacation.
Wow.
You know, what are we going to do in that case? Is it okay that we don't buy you every gift that you want? We're saving for that trip to Disneyland, for instance, in America, right? So it becomes a family effort, and they put it in the fridge. Before that, it was just him and his wife, and it was just a conversation every quarter. You would have a 90-day planning in business, but they actually did it in their life, and it's very good.
I think that's fantastic. You know, just the other day I had someone approach me who I know say, you know, I've done really well, I've got a house, I want to build on our land, I want to create, you know, an opportunity where we've got our children around us. And we do a lot of work with legacy planning, and when you say to people, well, let's get the kids involved, you know, and when I say kids, they're like in their 30s, so they're not, you know, 12, 15, but let's get the kids involved, let's talk about it, and let's everybody understand what mum and dad are working towards, and what's going to and how it's going to be inherited. Because when that horrible day does come that you lose a loved one, you don't want to be scrapping around trying to work out the will and having arguments about money. And I'm sure we've all got friends and family where money rips a family apart. It's not organised and put together correctly.
Yeah. Well, what about splitting up relationships? Because a lot of people who get divorced or just split up, they assume they've been able to count on their fair share being together for, let's say, for 20 years, but then they end up only getting a minuscule of what they are promised or that they deserve. How do you protect yourself from that?
Again, knowledge, I think, again, without sounding really cliche, it's so important. Again, another stat out there is that 60% of women don't know they should update their pension records after a relationship ends. And if you compare that to the male sort of, is nearer 40%. So there's an imbalance in knowledge and understanding, which then means that when people go and try and sort themselves out after they've gone through a breakup, which is a difficult enough time as it is, they actually don't know where to start. And again, that's where, you know, simple information online, you know, there's government sites out there like Money Advice Service and things like that, which give you, you know, there are specific sections in which allow you to be able to go, right, here's a starting point, here's the questions I need to ask myself.
Yeah.
And that, again, that's your starting point, I think, really.
We work with quite a lot of divorce coaches who we work alongside their clients, helping them from a financial point of view. And there's some specific complications in and around pensions that a lot of people are not aware of. And then, of course, when you're going through a divorce, depending on what's happened, it can get quite nasty, and people might be inclined to hide money from
especially if there's a third person involved.
Yes,
Correct.
definitely.
Yeah.
So there's a lot to take into account, and I think it's one of the main triggers that makes a man or a woman say, I need to get financial advice now. So we do work with a lot of women and men going through divorce, and again, that's quite a traumatic, stressful time in someone's life, and it's about being really honest, having those upfront conversations, challenging things, but holding their hand and saying it's okay. We'll get through this together.
Yeah. Okay. Well, I want to continue the conversation with some final tips about making sure you're personally protected, at least financially. We'll be back after this.
This is Radio Bath.
And we're still with Brave Business Conversation with Unividual, Cherie-Anne Baxter and Greg Harris. We're here talking about protecting your personal net worth when you're in a relationship. Final segment. Lots of things to talk about. What do you guys want to talk about? I know you've got whole notes. I don't want to.
Yeah, I think from start to finish, it's important to explain quite briefly. If you wanted a quick tick list of some of the things that you could be thinking about, Greg could go through sort of a start to finish approach.
Yeah, I think that without scaring people, there's quite a lot for people to look at, but you don't have to do it all at once, and that's the understanding that you can actually segment it out as to, for you as an individual, you as a couple, or you as a family, there are going to be different risks there. But it's simple things like wills and powers of attorney. It's so inexpensive now to get those kind of things in place, and so important. I mean, I've experienced family members and clients who have not had either of those things in place, despite nudging, should we say, and it does cause really big issues. While you're alive, it's things like your income protection, if you're off work, sick or things like that, then actually having a replacement income pay out so that you're not worried about having to go back to work. You go back when you're healthy, not when you have to. And your critical illness and your life cover also to replace, pay off mortgages or to replace situations and money when you are ill or no longer around for your family. And then that ties into sort of longer term planning, like inheritance tax, for instance. Inheritance tax is one of those things where in the UK at the moment, and again, we'll touch wood and hope things stay the same as they are, but it's very easy to protect against families paying inheritance tax. Yet the revenues that the HMRC are generating from it are staggering. And if you've got a healthy couple, husband and wife or same-sex couple, and they've got children or dependents that they want to pass their assets on to, it's really straightforward to get sorted. And, often when we go out to present options to people are, strapping themselves in for a 2 or 3 hour, really intense, really technical meeting. And it's not like that at all. Sometimes you can overcomplicate things, can't we? When people want to, but that, again, is personal choice. And then it's just about keeping a clean house. We talked about bank accounts earlier, didn't we? And about making sure that you haven't got multiple accounts, or actually keeping the ones that you need, or maybe having a joint account if that's easier and cleaner. Exactly the same thing for pensions and investments. Nowadays it's, again, quite straightforward to have all of your investments, all of your pensions on one platform, rather than having, we had a client a couple of months ago, didn't we, had 11 pensions scattered all over the place because she'd bounced around work. Now, obviously, she's still picking up those benefits, but if you said to her before we sort of engaged, how much do you have in your pensions total? It's finger in the wind job. Whereas if you've got it all in one place, you've got your statements coming through every quarter, and you know if you're on track to those goals, which are, as we said, so important to set.
Yeah. And what are some of the common mistakes, aside from not preparing, not having that conversation? What are some common mistakes that you've seen?
I think a lot of people, some people start off thinking, I can do it myself, but then they've got a job, they've got kids, they've got hobbies, and they start off with good intentions and don't follow through. I think we don't diagnose ourselves when we're unwell. We don't try and fix the big leak in the kitchen. We get a plumber in. So I think it's about saying, okay, I'm not a specialist in these areas. I can outsource it, which we're used to doing with other areas. But I'll never forget the time that I was in the office and I had a call from a young lady who was literally crying on the phone, saying she had this huge inheritance tax bill to pay because her father had passed away and there was a personal circumstance which meant she had to pay this bill. And he didn't know about it, she didn't know about it, and it was going to result in her having to sell the house. And it's situations like that where you think, I just wish that there was a way that we could have reached out to that family, because it would have meant the world and made such a difference to them.
Yeah. And I think also trying to have that conversation, we did mention this, but trying to have that conversation with your partner, yourself, can actually be very unproductive, because if emotions get in the way, depending on where you are in that relationship, you may not get the most out of it, and you might not know how to manage yourselves and know how to listen. We were talking in the break about listing a bunch of questions, but again, the questions are great, gets you started, but how do you listen?
Yeah,
how do you understand? And then when when, let's say, one of you is more financially savvy than the other, and they start talking gibberish, financial gibberish, and you're trying to like pretend to understand as not to look silly. Actually, when you've got someone, a mediator next to you, can actually, do you understand that, and can probably explain to you, because not everybody is similar in their financial acumen, isn't it?
No.
And we pride ourselves on educating people throughout the process. So if we are sitting in front of people who want to actually understand how it all works, how a pension works, how investments work, we do a lot of education. And sometimes, as Greg referred to before, we get people who were doing their own finances, quite often because they worked in financial services, and then they've realised actually there's so much more that a qualified financial advisor can do, but they're interested in it. So it might mean that an hour meeting might become 3 hours because they want to understand how these investment vehicles work, or whatever it is that you're going through. So everyone has a different journey, and everyone has different reasons why they use an advisor. But the starting point is, do I need financial advice? Yes. Who do I know, or who can I trust to then look after my money? And where do I need to go? And then it's just about starting the process and having some faith in the person that you're working with.
Exactly. And if this latter part, this end segment, as you know, we're talking about all these financial terms, if all that is gobbledygook to you, right, it's maybe time to contact you guys. You have like free sessions or something like that?
Yeah, we do. So we always offer people a free introductory session, and through that we get really good understanding of what people are trying to achieve. Ask them all those difficult questions. We run through how we work with clients, the services that we offer, what charges are involved in each of those services, which is really important. People understand that before they engage. And you know, we'll run through some testimonials and some case studies with people, and then we leave them to it. We don't, follow up the next day or a couple of days after. We leave them completely to it for a couple of weeks to come back to us if they're comfortable in doing so. And there'll be rare occasions where we'll actually say, do you know what, it's quite simple what you're looking for. Maybe have a look at this or this first, and then we can take it a bit further from that. It's not always getting people to commit to what we do.
We had someone come through on the website this week actually who needed just some guidance and a pointing in the right direction, and a lot of companies wouldn't have even contacted them, but Greg rang the person up, had a good chat, said, look, this is the area that I think you need to go down, and gave them some links to websites to give them some support. So we try to do our bit for everybody in the local community.
That's good. That's good. Even for the staff and volunteers at Radio Bath, you've offered that service, so that's very kind. So we've been talking a lot about how to protect your personal financial worth. If you want more information, your website is
unividual.co.uk.
Unividual.co.uk. You've got Instagram, LinkedIn.
Yeah, Instagram, LinkedIn, Facebook, whatever tickles your fancy.
Unividual,
Unividual,
think about it this way: individual, unique individual.
Yeah, it's a mashup of unique individuals.
Unividual, that's great. Okay, thank you so much for being on the show.
Welcome.
Thank you for having us.
We really enjoyed it.
Yeah, as always, we'll be back every month, actually.
Yeah,
right?
with some more crazy chat.
Yeah, Cherie-Anne's got a list.
I have. I've got a long list.
Yeah, we've got a long list. This is going to be Unividual Radio Education Session.
Yeah.
Okay,
Yes,
we're going to
love
change
it.
the name. Yeah, it's so important. It's not a topic that's easy to talk about, but it is very essential. And after the news hour, I will come back to you with the usual business clinic. We'll talk about topics. And I'll give you some suggestions, case studies, and solutions that will hopefully help you progress in your business, your leadership, and your life after this.